Hi, my name is Marcelo Zimmer, and I am a weed science program specialist at Purdue University. Today I'll be talking about the herbicide-resistant weeds that cause the biggest headaches in soybeans here in the state of Indiana. We have several weeds that have developed herbicide resistance here in the state of Indiana. This table here summarizes all the different weed species that have developed resistance to a certain herbicide mode of action here in Indiana. And as you can see, we have a few weeds that have developed resistance to the photosystem 2 inhibitor herbicides, or also known as the group 5 herbicides. Those are herbicides like atrazine or metribuzin, for example. So we have four species here that have developed resistance to this mode of action. We also have quite a few different weeds that have developed resistance to the ALS inhibitor herbicides, also known as the group 2 herbicides. Those are herbicides like Classic, First Rate, Canopy, Scepter, and Pursue, for example. And it only requires a point mutation on their genetic code to develop resistance to the ALS herbicides. And that is the reason why we have so many weeds that have developed resistance to this particular mode of action. We also have 5 weeds that have developed resistance to glyphosate in Indiana, or also known as the group 9 herbicides. This includes weed species such as common ragweed, giant ragweed, horseweed or Marestail, tall waterhemp, and palmer amaranth. And this is a huge problem for us because we rely on glyphosate so much for our weed management in corn and soybeans. And we also have waterhemp and palmer amaranth in Indiana that have developed resistance not only to ALS herbicides but also glyphosate and the PPO inhibitor herbicides, or the group 14, which include herbicides such as Flexstar and Cobra for post-emergence. So we can have those resistance as a single resistant type. We can have multiple resistant populations, like we can see highlighted here in this box. So we have 4 different weeds in Indiana that have developed resistance simultaneously to the ALS herbicides and also glyphosate, which makes it really challenging for management post-emergence in soybeans. And we also have tall waterhemp and palmer amaranth that have developed resistance to ALS herbicides, glyphosate, and also the PPO herbicides, all within the same population. And that's what we call the multiple resistant weed populations. And those are the most challenging weeds to control in a corn or soybean field because we have we're so limited in the options of post-emergence herbicides that we can use. And as we can see from the previous slide, herbicide resistance is a huge problem for Indiana, and not only Indiana, but all the soybean and corn producing states here in the Midwest. And to adopt the right strategy for herbicide resistance management, we first have to understand how herbicide resistance develops. So the first thing we got to keep in mind is that herbicide resistant weeds already exist in the wild populations, but they occur at very low levels. So let's say the first time we spray a certain herbicide, there are already some plants within that population that are resistant to that herbicide. And if we keep spraying the same herbicide year after year, we start to increase the frequency of those resistant plants within the population until to a point that we cannot get successful control or effective control with that particular herbicide. So every time we do a herbicide application, we'll be selecting for the weeds that possess a certain natural mutation that confers resistance to the herbicide that we just applied. So if no other weed control measure is taken, the resistant weeds will reproduce and create more resistant plants. So the best thing you can do to prevent the selection for those herbicide resistant weeds is to use an integrated weed management approach, where we don't use only the herbicide, but we also do some roguing at the end of the growing season, or we do other mechanical practices, so we prevent those weeds from producing seeds and increasing the weed seed bank of those resistant plants. And now, without further ado, I want to talk about some of the most problematic weeds that we have here in the state of Indiana and how we can manage them every growing season to prevent them from causing yield losses. The first weed I want to talk about is horseweed, which is also known as Marestail. Horseweed is a winter or a summer annual weed, which means it can either emerge in the fall or in the spring, and that characteristic is going to have implications in weed management. In some areas of Indiana, we're going to have more fall emerge horseweed. In some other areas, you're going to have more spring emerge horseweed. So if we have fall emerge Marestail and we don't do anything to control that Marestail in the fall, what can happen is that when we come back in the spring to do our weed management strategy to spray a burn down, those plants may be a little too big to control with a single herbicide application. And that's one of the scenarios where a fall herbicide application might be beneficial for improving weed control efficacy. So our recommendation for Marestail management in corn and soybeans is that you want to have a field that is free of Marestail at the time of planting. And there are several different ways you can go about accomplishing that. You can use tillage close to the time of planting. If you're a conventional till farmer, tillage is very effective for control Marestail. Marestail has very small seeds, so if you bury those seeds into the soil, they're not going to emerge as well or as effectively. Or if you are a no-till farmer, you can do an aggressive burn down approach. What do we mean by an aggressive burn down approach? Is to plan a 2-pass burn down program. Either do a fall herbicide application followed by a spring application, or you can do 2 applications in the spring if the weather allows. And like I said in the previous slide, if you only do spring applications, you might need a respray because those plants might be a little too big by the time you get to the field to do your burn down application. Another thing to keep in mind is that you should not rely on glyphosate or 2,4-D alone, especially if you're spraying just a pint of 2,4-D. Herbicides like dicamba or elevore are slightly better than 2,4-D, and that's what we've seen consistently with our field trials. But regardless of which one of those synthetic auxin herbicides that you're going to use, you got to keep in mind that synthetic auxins are not going to work well on large plants. So if you're spraying plants that are larger than 8 inches, you're not going to have good activity with those herbicides. It might take quite a bit of time until you get a complete kill of those plants. We also recommend that you use a full rate of soil residual herbicides, and you want to spray those residual herbicides in the spring. You're not going to get as much of a benefit of using residuals with your fall application. So if you want to optimize your expenses, save that residual for the spring application instead. And some of the herbicides that have the most effectiveness for residual control Marestail are herbicides such as metribuzin. You want to use a full rate of 5 ounces or more to the acre, or products like Valor, Authority, or Zidua, for example, are going to provide good suppression of Marestail throughout the first half of the growing season. Our options for post-control of Marestail and soybeans are very limited, especially considering that a lot of those populations that we have in Indiana are already glyphosate and ALS resistance. So what can we do post-emergence? We can grow corn. We have more options if you're growing corn. But if you're growing soybeans, you have to switch to a soybean trait that allows for applications of effective herbicides post-emergence. So you can grow something like LibertyLink soybeans, which allow for applications of Liberty or other glufosinate products post-emergence. Or you can switch to a trait like Roundup Ready to Extend or Extend Flex, where you can use dicamba post-emergence. And in the case of Extend Flex, you can also use glufosinate products like Liberty post-emergence, and those are going to be effective on Marestail. Or we can use Enlist E3 soybeans. For Enlist E3 soybeans, you can spray herbicides such as 2,4-D or glufosinate, or even tank mix 2,4-D with glufosinate, which will be a highly effective tank mixture for Marestail control in soybeans. Next weed I want to talk about today is giant ragweed. Giant ragweed, as you can see in the image in the screen right now, is a highly competitive weed with both corn and soybeans, and it can cause up to a 30 to 90% yield reduction if it's left uncontrolled in corn or soybeans. It can also serve as an alternate host for stem boring insects, And those plants that are injured by those insects may be a little harder to control with your post-emergence application, because the herbicide is not going to translocate as well throughout the plant for those plants that have been damaged by the insects. Another interesting thing about giant ragweed is that it can emerge from April to August, so it can be a problem throughout the entire growing season. It can also germinate up to 5 inches deep into the soil profile. And that's one of the reasons that we have variable efficacy of soil residual herbicides, because if we don't get a good activating rain that brings that herbicide to where the giant ragweed seed is, we're not going to get good activity of those residual herbicides. And that's one of the reasons why the residual herbicides that we spray for giant ragweed are not that effective. And we also have identified herbicide resistance to two of the most efficacious herbicide families that we use in soybeans, which are the group 2 herbicides or the ALSs, or group 9 herbicides, which is glyphosate. And this map here is just to show you the distribution of herbicide-resistant giant ragweed throughout the state of Indiana. The map on the left shows glyphosate resistance populations that we identified across the state. This is likely an underestimation of the problem, because we only conducted surveys in 2008 and 2014. We haven't had a survey since then, so we're likely to have more glyphosate-resistant populations across the state than what is showed in this map. For ALS resistance, these are the counties that we identified for having ALS-resistant giant ragweed. This is also likely an underestimation of the problem, because we only test populations or plants that are submitted to our diagnostic lab here at Purdue, the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab, or PPDL. So if we don't get samples in the PPDL, we're not able to test for those mutations. So this is likely, again, an underestimation of the problem here in Indiana. So what can we do for giant ragweed control in soybeans? As of pre-emergence, we can use tillage close to the time of planting for conventional till soybeans if you're doing that. But if you're a no-till farmer, we can use some burn down programs such as glyphosate plus C4D, or glyphosate plus dicamba, or sharpen, or glyphosate plus sharpen for a burn down application. Either one of those combinations are going to be effective on giant ragweed. The auxins are highly effective for giant ragweed. Or we can use also a tank mix of gramoxone plus metribuzin plus C4D, and that's another tank mix that is highly effective on giant ragweed for a burn down application. Also, if you still have ALS susceptible populations in your fields, you can use some of the ALS herbicides such as Canopy, First Rate, Valor XLT, Scepter, and all these other herbicides. They're still going to provide some suppression of giant ragweed pre-emergence if you have ALS susceptible populations. For post-emergence in giant ragweed, we are assuming that you have ALS and glyphosate resistance. There are still options for non-GMO soybean growers, for giant ragweed at least. So you can use Flexer followed by Cobra as a post-emergence application. If you have Liberty-Link soybeans, you can use 2 passes of a glufosinate product. For Extend soybeans, you can use a dicamba product, such as Extendimax or Ingenia. For Enlist E3 soybeans, you can use 2,4-D, Enlist 1 or Enlist Duo, or Liberty as well. Or you can text mix 2,4-D with Liberty, and that will be a highly effective combination for giant ragweed. And also for Extend Flex soybeans, you can use a dicamba product or Liberty as well as a post-emergency strategy for giant ragweed. One thing I would like to point out though is that regardless of which one of those soybean traits that you're using and which herbicide you're using post-emergence, the timing of that post-application is critical. Giant ragweed is one of those weeds that grows very rapidly, so it's very easy to miss your application window. And especially the contact herbicides such as glufosinate or Flexer or Cobra, they are not going to be effective if you're spraying large plants. And even though you can get away with spraying an auxin on larger giant ragweed plants, that's a terrible strategy if you're trying to prevent the development of herbicide resistance. So you want to spray those plants when they're small. You also want to keep in mind that giant ragweed can emerge pretty much throughout the entire growing season, so you gotta scout fields for late emergence and escapes as well. Now I'm gonna talk about the Amaranthus species. They're also known as the pigweeds. We have two major pigweeds in Indiana that are usually problematic. We have Waterhemp. It's usually more of a problem in wet years. It likes soil moisture for germination. So if you have a dry spell around right after planting, sometimes you can get away with very low Waterhemp pressure. While Palmer Amaranth, it prefers dry weather. So usually if you have some wet conditions around early in the season, you actually have less Palmer Amaranth problems. So you can easily kill Palmer Amaranth if you have some flooding conditions during early in the season. So first we gotta understand some of the biology of a Waterhemp and Palmer Amaranth. They are very prolific seed producers. They can produce in between 100,000 to 500,000 seeds per female. So if you have a few plants left at the end of the growing season, that's enough to increase your weed seed bank. They also produce very small seeds, and they emerge mostly from the top 1 inch of the soil. So they prefer no-till or minimal-till soils, but they can still be a problem in soils where tillage is a practice, especially if you've been having Waterhemp or Palmer issues for several years. You already mixed up all the seed throughout the entire soil profile. They can also be easily spread by wildlife, manure, grain, seed, or feed contamination, or especially by equipment such as combines, for example. They also have a long emergence period. For Waterhemp, they can emerge anywhere from April all the way to July, depending on weather conditions such as soil moisture and temperature. For Palmer Amaranth, it has a slightly longer emergence window from April all the way to August. So pretty much the entire growing season we can have those plants emerging. They also grow very rapidly, especially for Palmer Amaranth. Under ideal weather conditions, it can grow during the vegetative stage between 2 to 3 inches in a single day. So that will make you miss the application window very quickly. They also dioecious reproductive system. So a plant is either a female or a male, so they obligate outcrossers, which means that a plant that develops resistance will also cross with other susceptible plants and spread herbicide resistance fairly quickly. These maps here show the distribution of herbicide-resistant Waterhemp in Indiana. As you can see here, we have several counties where we already confirmed resistance to glyphosate. Again, this is probably an underestimation of the issue because we only test for those samples that are submitted to the diagnostic lab. And the same goes for PPO resistance. Those are the counties where we confirm PPO resistance in Indiana. We only test for one mutation for PPO resistance, but actually more mutations out there. We only test for the most common mutation that occurs due to time and money constraints with testing for all these mutations. So our recommendation for Waterhemp control in soybeans, this is assuming that we have glyphosate and ALS resistance, but we still do not have PPO resistance. What can we do? We want to start clean and use residuals at the time of planting. Some of the best residuals for Waterhemp control in soybeans are herbicides such as Authority, Valor, or Zidua. Herbicides such as metribuzin, Duo, Warrant, or Outlook, or even Prowl. They can be effective, but my first choice will be those products that are in the first bullet point. We also want to be timely about our post-emergence application. Like I mentioned before, those plants go very rapidly. So if you miss your post-application treatment, you might have a poor activity of those herbicides. We also want to add another layer of residual herbicides, mostly group 15 herbicides such as Duo, Warrant, Zidua, or Outlook, with that post-application to prevent plants from emerging late in the growing season and still producing seeds. So what are our options for post-emergence? If you're a non-GMO soybean grower, You can still use herbicides such as Flexstar, Cobra, or Blazer. Again, this is assuming that we do not have resistance to the PPO herbicides yet. Or you can grow LiberLink soybeans and use a glufosinate product such as Liberty, or in Extend soybeans a dicamba product such as XtendMax, Ingenia, or Tavium. And for Enlist E3 soybeans, you can use either 2,4-D or Liberty, or a combination of those two. And again, for Extend Flex, you can use a dicamba product and also a glufosinate product such as Liberty as well. But again, regardless of which one of those strategies you're using, we recommend that you use another layer of residual with that post-application to prevent some late emerging plants from producing seeds later in the growing season. And you might be asking, why should I use a layer residual for water hemp control? And this diagram here kind of illustrates why it is a good idea. So again, this red triangle thing represents a residual herbicide. So it started with a high concentration of residual herbicide, and it slowly decreases to a point where it's not effective at suppressing water hemp or palmer anymore. So here we have a traditional soybean program and a layer residual soybean program. As you can see in the traditional soybean program, we do the burn down application of the residual herbicide, and sometime around June we run out of that residual herbicide and we do our post application to control weeds. But we still have a window of time that we call here a vulnerable period of time, where water hemp or palmer can still emerge and we still don't have crop canopy yet. But if you use a layer residual soybean program, by the time that residual herbicide starts to tamper off and reduce effectiveness, we do our post application and a little bit more of residual herbicide, and that's just enough to cover a vulnerable period of time until we actually reach crop canopy, and that will get us will keep us protected throughout the entire growing season. That's our recommended approach, especially water hemp and palmer, because again, those weeds can germinate throughout the entire growing season, and even very small plants can still produce a few thousand seeds, and that will keep the weed seed bank going and will keep you dealing with those weeds in the long term. Now we're looking at water hemp control on soybeans, assuming that we have glyphosate and ALS resistance, and we also have PPO resistance on top of that. So the recipe is pretty much the same. You can still use the PPO herbicides such as Authority and Valor as a residual herbicide at planting. They're still going to be effective at suppressing those plants, although they might have a shorter window of residual activity compared to susceptible populations. The big difference here is that you have no options for non-GMO soybean growers. So if you're growing non-GMO soybeans, you cannot use Flexstar, Cobra, or Blazer as a post-emergence herbicide, because those are not going to be effective on water hemp or palmer with PPO resistance. So in that case, you have to switch to a trait that allows you to spray another effective herbicide post-emergence. For palmer amaranth, the recipe, the recommendation is pretty much the same. The herbicides that are effective for water hemp are also going to be effective for palmer amaranth. The only important thing is that you know your status for glyphosate, ALS, or PPO resistance in that population that you're dealing with. So as we could see in the previous slides, herbicide resistance is widespread in the state of Indiana. We have several problematic weeds that have developed resistance to the most effective post-herbicides that we have out there. So what we want to do is start thinking about other practices that we can use to suppress those weeds and help our herbicides take some of the pressure off of the herbicides, so we're not relying only on the herbicides for weed management. So there's a few cultural practices that we can use, especially with the pigweeds, to reduce their spread and reduce some of the pressure that we have on those herbicides that we use post-emergence. So what we can do is use tillage to control emerged plants. Tillage is always going to be effective on herbicide-resistant weeds. That's not going to change. And if you have a heavily infested field, you can use dip tillage to bury all that seed that's sitting on the soil surface deep into the soil profile. And once you do that, you should not use tillage for several years, because you want to keep that seed buried into the soil profile to avoid it from emerging during the growing season. Again, Palmer amaranth and Waterhemp, they only emerge from the top 1 inch of the soil surface. So if you bury all that seed deep into the soil profile, most of it should not emerge anymore. You can also use cover crops as another strategy to reduce the pressure of Waterhemp and Palmer amaranth emergence. The cover crops have shown more promise in the southern United States, where the spring weather is more predictable. In our case in Indiana, our results are kind of mixed bag of good and bad with cover crops, although cereal rye is one of the most consistent ones for weed suppression. Annual rye has not worked well for Palmer or Waterhemp control here in our trials in Indiana. We mostly recommend that you stick with something like cereal rye, because cereal rye produces a lot of biomass in the spring, and that helps us suppress those weeds from emerging throughout the growing season. Hand weeding, it happens quite often in extreme cases in the southern United States. We are not in such a bad spot just yet in Indiana, but we gotta be willing to pull a few escapes at the end of the growing season, because like I said earlier, those plants can produce hundreds of thousands of seeds in a single plant. So if you're removing a few escapes at the end of the growing season, that can drastically reduce your weed seed bank on the following growing season, and allow you to have a sustainable herbicide program in the years to come. You also want to control pigweeds in the field edges and the drainage ditches. A lot of times we focus only on the field, and other weeds are slowly entering our fields from the edges and the drainage ditches. So we gotta look at those as well, make sure pigweeds are not growing in those areas of the field as well. And finally, we gotta keep in mind that combines are great spreaders of those pigweeds. So we wanna make sure we harvest our heavily infested fields last. And once we harvest those fields, we wanna take our combine back to the shop, clean it very well, and make sure we get all that pigweed seed out of the combines, because we don't wanna spread those seeds into newer areas. And if you can afford to, maybe you set that combine on fire, but if you cannot, you gotta make sure you clean it very well, otherwise you're gonna have problems in other fields in the following years. And this picture here is just to illustrate a little bit how easy it is to get those pigweeds introduced to your fields. This is a picture from a farmer that purchased some hay that came all the way from Kansas, and as you can see here, there's some Palmer amaranth growing out of those hay piles. Kansas is a state that is notorious for having all sorts of herbicide-resistant issues. So if you are going to get Palmer amaranth from anywhere, Kansas will be the last place you want to get Palmer amaranth from. So you always got to watch out when you're purchasing hay or manure or even cover crop seeds. You got to make sure you don't have weed seed contamination as well, because that's going to create a bigger problem for you as well. And that's one of the reasons also why dairy farmers were one of the first ones to have issues with Palmer amaranth here in the state of Indiana. And this picture here is just showing is a Waterhemp plant growing on top of a house here in downtown Lafayette, Indiana. There's some research from the University of Missouri that has shown that migratory birds can ingest Palmer and Waterhemp seeds, and those seeds stay viable even after digestion. So migratory birds are also another source for introduction of those herbicide-resistant weeds into new fields as well. And in this other photo here, you can see a Waterhemp plant growing in a sidewalk. So basically, probably a semi or a truck or something drove by and dropped one seed right here. So those plants don't require a lot of soil to actually produce a decent amount of seeds and to grow fairly well. This picture here is just to illustrate that even if you don't have those problems yet, you should still be scouting your fields every year, because you never know when those weeds are going to be introduced to a new area. And this is my last slide for today. I just want to point out some of the resources that we have available for you. We have a website, a Facebook page, a YouTube channel. You can also reach out to Bill and I using our emails or phone numbers, or even follow our Twitter accounts for some quick updates on what's going on with the industry, new technologies coming out as well. And we also have the weed guide, which has a lot of useful information for you as well. So again, thanks for paying attention. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at Purdue Weed Science, and have a great day.